All right, I'm still glistening a little bit from my
You
morning.
are a little glistening.
I know. It's the baldness and it's the sweat from my walk. Hey, Jay Trivedi here with me today. Just so everybody knows, Jay is a friend of mine, and we actually know one another from girls' youth basketball. He lives in the next town over, and somehow we ended up on the same club team for a couple of years. So he's with me today. Jay's the CEO of a company in Boston called Uphams, and I'll let him tell you a little bit about it. But more or less, what they do is they provide comprehensive healthcare for an area called North Dorchester and surrounding towns. He and I are going to talk about everything from his childhood all the way up until how he got into this work. But before we dive into that, Jay, welcome. And is there anything I missed there?
I think that was it, Dave. Thanks for having me on today.
You got it. So tell me, I noticed I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, and obviously I know you're the CEO of Uphams. I don't think I realized until I did a little digging that you've been there for roughly 20 years. So you started off as kind of an operations manager. Today you're the CEO. Tell me real quick, like why did you get into this line of work?
Well, I mean, that kind of ties back into how I got into healthcare and my childhood and my upbringing. But honestly, I worked in med devices. You're right, it's about 20 years I've been at Uphams. But I worked in med devices prior to that, worked in EMS, and and I knew I wanted to do work in healthcare once that med device company I worked for shut down. It was a startup, and the VCs eventually, after a few rounds, said, it's not sustainable. And so I really just got online, and back in the day, it was called hotjobs.com, and I looked for operational type work in the healthcare field, and that's honestly how I stumbled upon Uphams.
So you went from med device and you transitioned from the for-profit world into the nonprofit world. What's that like? That's a pretty unique transition. I don't know if it's easy or hard, but what was your initial reaction to that?
So the way we spend money is different. But again, 20 years ago, I was a lot younger and it was a startup. So I was all in and doing the work. And back then, the startup really threw food at you and just time and the camaraderie of the people who were trying to get the product up and running. We were spending 12 hours, 14 hours a day on site. 20 years ago, it wasn't really like we had cell phones and all these mobile devices where we could kind of work from everywhere. So we were really all on site. And and so that transition and the amount of work that had to continue was about the same, in my opinion. The biggest difference I noticed is the infrastructure. I remember, it was 2004 when I started here, and the computer wasn't the primary device in my predecessor's workspace. And for me, that's all I used. And when I did find the computer in the office, it was still loaded with Windows 95. So technology, that type of hardware infrastructure, and the tools needed to get the work done wasn't readily available. So that was the biggest shock to me is, how do I not use my computer for all the work I do? All at the startup company, like we had voicemail that was digitized back then on our computers, and here it was still old analog lines and how you got calls. So it was that piece that was the biggest piece.
How much has the company evolved in the last 20 years?
I think it's evolved quite a bit. Technology is definitely, because healthcare has evolved quite a bit, and technology is definitely a main staple in our everyday lives, for better or for worse. That's how even we provide some healthcare. We can talk about telehealth and COVID times, but healthcare is not meant to be remote. You have to have hands on your patient. It's evolving, don't get me wrong. And I do see a need and a space for telehealth, but a lot of people still want to come see their providers in person.
Right. So what caused Uphams to focus on North Dorchester as opposed to say Chelsea? Yeah, I'm making up the names.
Nope, you're not making it up. You're actually spot on. So, what happened was back in the 70s, primary care providers were really doing a mass exodus from the city. And there's a huge movement back then by community health centers. And the first one was actually founded in Dorchester at Columbia Point. It's the Geiger Gibson Health Center. But a group of concerned citizens in the Uphams Corner neighborhood got together formed the Uphams Corner Health Committee and said we need to really be able to provide care locally instead of having our community members go all over the place. And so these community members got together and understood that this community health center movement was just starting in Columbia Point, but also in Mississippi. And they grabbed a hold of that. And because this was their neighborhood, that's why the health center was formed in this area. You know, one clinic office. It's a lot different now than it was then. It was a leased spot at 500 Columbia Road. Today we're 8 sites, own most of them, over 500 employees, provide comprehensive care beyond just a health center. We have a home care division, we have a PACE program, we have a women, infants, and children's program. And when I back up and say, you know, we provide comprehensive care, we also have dental, eye, lab, radiology, women's health, primary care, pediatrics, a teen clinic, a Ryan White's program. So we do provide a lot of services in the neighborhood.
How do you fund all of this?
So in 2015, we became a federally qualified health center. 10 years before then, we were a look-alike federally qualified health center. And essentially what that means is we became able to apply for federal grants through HRSA. And that is about 4% of our income, our revenue. However, 60% of our patient population are on Medicaid. So that's the insurance that we provide a service, we bill Medicaid, they pay us back. About 25% or so, and don't hold me exact to the numbers, is Medicare, and we have a small amount of private insurance individuals. So there's a misunderstanding that community health centers provide to, we like to say, underserved areas. These are not poor people, these are underserved areas, and there's limited access to care. You know, they're maybe on mass health, but that doesn't mean they're not working. That's another, I think, misconception of the inner city neighborhoods from those of us who live in the suburbs. A lot of these individuals who we provide care to are single parents, have multiple jobs, have come over to the US from another country, and have been really just working diligently and trying to make lives for themselves. There's statements out there about people from our neighborhoods that are just untrue. Every neighborhood has its challenging individuals.
But let me ask you this on the healthcare providers that left the neighborhood. Like, what was the logic behind no longer providing services to the neighborhood?
Better quality of life in the suburbs. Private practice out there in the suburbs. It was, you know, why do we live in the suburbs? It's, you know, we had the opportunity to get out. It was a rougher neighborhoods back then as well. Back in the 70s, I think people were burning some of their own houses down to collect the insurance money.
What are you doing? What are you doing right now to attract the healthcare providers, the doctors, the resources?
Well, that's $1 million question. It's really hard recruiting not just providers, but all types of individuals. Again, I think it's the changes in the workforce as generational changes are happening, and post-COVID, everyone wants a balance, and it's not just providers who are easily burnt out, because they are the stop where people come to get their answers. And if you don't have access or limited access to behavioral health concerns, they stop at the provider and they unload on their provider. These providers are going through so many emotional, I want to say emotional strength. They're taxing on their emotions as they're working with a patient who has diabetes that's uncontrolled. And then the patient is saying that they have 3 kids and one of them is on the spectrum or the other one is on an IEP, and they work 2 jobs. And guess what? The health center has rescheduled their appointment 3 times because of the provider turnover or provider themselves being sick or out or unavailable. And all that falls on the provider. The call center hears it, the receptionists hear it, the medical assistants hear it, but they stop in front of the provider. And that provider, from a nurse practitioner to DO to a PA to an MD, they're in front of you and say, I have 14 problems. and the provider turns around and says, you have 15, 20 minutes, right? How do you manage that? Well, pick two priorities. Well, okay, well, food insecurity, housing insecurity, kids that are disabled, my own health issues. And I'm going to have a mental health breakdown because I had to, take much time off of work because I had to reschedule my appointments with the provider. Pick two, doc. So hearing all that, providers leave. They leave healthcare altogether. They go to private practice themselves. They go to specialty care. We've lost 3 providers. We had a provider just leave because they themselves couldn't afford the city. And that's a provider getting paid at a provider level. What about our medical assistants who are from the community? We pride ourselves on hiring from the city. We have about 60% of our employees live in Boston. And if our providers are saying they can't afford Boston, how can our other team members afford Boston? That's another fundamental issue. So it's hard recruiting. We've been using recruiters more than ever before, but that's $20,000 here, $20,000 there, right off the top. So it's hard recruiting, and it's different than 30 years ago where people were really in this work purely for the mission and they made everything else work. People may still be in it for the mission, but they are very much so in tune with what they need for their survival.
Are you able to retain the people you pay fees for, or do you
No,
lose?
that's one who just left.
Okay, so you paid the fee, and so how long does somebody stay before they?
It depends on the contracts, right? It's a recruiter's market as well. So I think that person stayed a little less than a year. So I think the way the agreements are written are 90 days, 120 days. If they stay, if they don't stay, we'll refund you back fully, or we'll help you recruit for another one at free of charge. And sometimes based on the recruiter, it could be like a 50% discount on the next because they feel bad. But
Yep. So let me ask you this, Jay. When you think about the people that you're serving, do you find that it sounds to me like your organization is kind of in a situation where you're in reactionary mode to whatever's coming in the door. What kind of services do you provide, or do you think you may provide in the future that might help the community get ahead of some of these problems? I know it's easier said than done, but proactive approach to healthcare, proactive approach to whether mental health, physical health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is that part of the offering, or will it be part of the offering at some point?
So we offer all of that. I think the biggest piece is how do we continue to provide these and how the patient needs to get it. We need to really understand what our patients need. And so we have behavioral health on site. We have, I mentioned, eye, dental, services for older adults. Our PACE program offers transportation to and from, and that's a completely different type of care model that provides services to allow these older adults to age gracefully in their own setting, in their own home environment. But for the health center side of the house, it's really trying to see how we can either connect our patients to services that we don't necessarily offer with an agency that's local that can provide it. A lot of our patients come in for benefits, so we have a benefits team that enrolls them in different insurances that they may be eligible for. And that's offered to any community member that may not have access. We have our community health advocates who can help our patients that when they come in may have food insecurities, housing instability. We connect them. We have a nutritionist. We have different grants that we've received from the city as well, where we can give away car seats, formula for those that are eligible or are in need. So trying to integrate all of that while offering what we already offer is the goal. Right now, I mentioned we have like 8 buildings, and trying to really integrate care to make it easily accessible for our patients is our ultimate goal. That's the biggest challenge because land is not affordable or even available, right? So
What are some things that you will be doing, say next year, a year after, et cetera, that maybe you're not able to do right now? What are some of the long-term goals there?
So one is trying to be financially stable. We took a hit last year and the year before. 2 years ago, we received a PPP loan to help Mass because it just costs more to pay our, staff costs more. Most of our expenses go into staffing. So trying to find a way to be fiscally responsible and financially stable is our ultimate goal. Another service we are launching, and we just have to make it sustainable, is a mobile health van. Right now, we're using it as an outreach van to maybe provide some point of care testing or educational materials on good oral hygiene, or here are some basic services that we offer at the clinic. The goal would be really being able to bring that out to the community and seeing what we can offer under our van's DPH license. So that would be goals, but we don't have a driver. We don't have that medical assistant or nurse. So right now we're pulling from primary care to staff that, but that creates a gap in primary care. So that's one of our major goals, to launch these mobile health vans. Another piece is really trying to connect with housing. Housing in the area and healthcare are one and one. Housing is healthcare. I had the opportunity to be on the governor's Housing is Healthcare panel a couple of weeks ago at Boston Medical Center, and that's where we spoke about the needs of the community. Lots of housing is being developed, but if it's displacing the current residents, then who is this neighborhood or the surrounding neighborhoods going to serve in the next 5 years? So our goal is to really work with housing partners to figure out how we can maybe even offer healthcare within the homes, like a semi-small clinic in a residential building. But the ultimate goal is also to be able to connect housing with healthcare so people don't lose housing and are able to afford it. Haven't figured all that out yet, but that's where the housing experts come into play.
So talk to me about a little bit about your upbringing. Where you come from, what your experiences were like as a child, and then how does that translate into what you do now? I'm curious because the reason I'm asking this question is it's not a glamorous job. You get the CEO title, but it's a monumental task trying to deal with some of the dynamics that you're dealing with. There's nothing easy about it, whether it's finding funding, finding resources, people, educating the community. It's almost like you're starting from underwater, just getting up to treading water. It's not glamorous. But what's inspiring you to do this? Because there are easier paths for your skill set, but obviously you must be fulfilled at some level.
Great question, and I appreciate some of the kind words you just said. But let's see, both my parents are foreign trained physicians. They immigrated to the U.S. in 1973 as residents. Did some training here in the States. My father showed up in this country with $8 in his pocket, trained as a physician. He actually had a background in neurosurgery. However, the states or the country system, he would have to go through residency and a lot more school that he wasn't willing to do. So he changed career paths from being a neurosurgeon to a psychiatrist.
Okay.
I think, that training plan was a lot less time. And my mom, she came over as an anesthesiologist. I think their original hopes were that they would work together in the ORs or whatnot. So because they were both physicians and really were working, physicians' hours back then, I have two younger brothers, and we were latchkey kids, essentially. And we grew up in North Medford, Massachusetts. So we were one of very few Indians in the neighborhood. So that was interesting. We were, looking back, I have a different sense of how I was originally seeing it when I was growing up. We were all friends, we were all kids. Racism wasn't felt by us, but I think looking back, it was in an indirect way. So seeing that and feeling that and being exposed just to medicine throughout my upbringing, it drew my natural interest. It was never pushed on myself or my brothers from my parents, but my father's one statement was, you whatever you go for, you give it 100%. Doesn't matter what it is, but you just got to give it 100%. And so those kind of were the words that stuck with me, and I still wanted medicine. So throughout my high school, I focused on biology, I focused on meds. I went to BU for undergrad. I got my undergraduate degree in human physiology from Sargent College, but my grades didn't cut it. That was that's the plain and honest truth. And so I had to figure out what I wanted to do. And so I still love medicine. And for me, there are a few key people in my life that helped push my trajectory in certain ways. My parents, obviously, my wife was the second one who kind of puts things in my head. And in college, I had a buddy who said he was going to take an EMT course at Northeastern. I said, "You want to go do that with me?" I said, "Well, I don't have a job besides the lab work I was doing in the neurophysiology lab at BU." So I had that professor kind of mentoring me because I still had neuroscience in my head. I still wanted to do neuro something in healthcare. So I started taking some master's classes at BU, took the EMT course at Northeastern, and I was working in the lab. And then I started working on the ambulance for a couple of years. And while I was working on the ambulance, I started teaching EMS at Northeastern, and I fell in love with EMS, and I fell in love with teaching EMS specifically. And I was working in the lab, working on the ambulance. So I was putting in about 70 hours a week. Again, I was living at home. I was 22, 23. So I was doing 70 hours. I was working 40 hours a week on the ambulance, and I think 24 hours at BU. And then I was teaching 6 to 8 hours a week. Fast forward to 2000, the grant at BU was ending, but that professor kept saying to me, she's like, you really have this innate skill for business. You really should think about business school. And by the way, the grant's ending. So she put that in my head, right? So she was one person. My buddy who EMS, he was number two. So then I get a random call from a guy I did my internship at the Beth Israel Hospital in their neuroscience lab, saying he's working for this med device startup company and would I like to go and do some research there. I said, well, I teach, I work on an ambulance, I'm planning on going to business school, but yeah, I can do some research at your office. I started, researching EKGs, so still similar paths, but it gave me this business side and the operational side of exposure with all this. So teaching, random shifts on the ambulance, full-time at the med device company, and nighttime school. Get my MBA in health administration. I have gotten promoted at the med device company into operations manager. And as we started shrinking, I took over manufacturing, customer service, data processing. And so it gave me a lot of exposure to a lot of different things at a young age. And then the med device company shut down. I was out of job for a few months, but I still kept teaching, and that's when I kind of picked up more shifts at the ambulance and doing the state examining. Had no kids. So again, it was just, my wife and I. So I was able to do all this extra time. And then I started at Uphams full time, stopped the ambulance work altogether, and I continued to teach. I got a call from that professor from BU who I was doing the research in and said, hey, we need a faculty advisor for some of these human physiology students, and we think you'd be great. So I stopped the teaching part and the examining part for EMS, and I shifted over to being a faculty advisor at BU. So I still do that part-time, and it's great because I still get exposure to the students. And I've been at Uphams since 2004. The CEO, who was my supervisor, retired in 2015. The board went through a rigorous interview process and just elected me and offered the position to me in 2015. And I took over fully in January of 2016. I shadowed him for a few months. And he was the first CEO. So I'm the second one Uphams has ever had.
Wow. It's so interesting. Your path is so similar to so many people I've talked to. It's a very indirect, unplanned path, but yet all of your experiences seem to lend to where you're at today. You had mentioned two things that struck me. One was you didn't experience racism as a child, but maybe your view of it now is a little bit different. I want to understand that. The other thing that I find interesting is that hands-on experience on an ambulance and the things that you must have seen on that job over the years. So Those two things alone, I can't imagine don't play a major role in your viewpoint today.
So I consider us my family. By the time I was old enough to remember anything of my childhood, I remember us living in a nice house, modest house, middle class family is the way I always look at it. We get, my parents would send money to our family in India. At one point, we had, I think, our family, two other of my dad's siblings and their families living in our house, and that was normal. And my grandmother lived with us. So I think at one point, I joke at our house that my parents still live in today. My bedroom was at one point every single room in that house except the bathroom or the kitchen. Like I literally had a bed. Like at one point, my cousin and I had bunk beds in the old living room, and we had a shower curtain as our door. I had the master bedroom when my parents shifted and added onto the house. So it's just fascinating. So that was very humbling, but we were able to add onto the house. I felt that we were privileged. We had a roof overhead. We never had to worry about food on the table. And so when I was looking at it as a kid, I thought we were, middle class family and we were just like everybody else. And I'll never forget this. I remember it was in elementary school. We had the first black family that I remembered move into our neighborhood. And they lasted a year. Like they were picking on him. And I'm like, wait a second, why are they doing that to him? They used to do that to me. And then it's just like, and I didn't like remember that until like probably 20 years ago, like 15 years ago. And I was like, wait a second, that was a great, like whatever happened to that kid? Like they like were here for a year and they were like, we're out of here. And it never like clicked for me.
Yeah.
And so little nuances like that, I was always the nerdy, quiet kid. One of, I don't know, one of 4 or 5 families that were Asian in the school. But it never dawned on me. Like, wait a second, this is strange. Why am I being excluded? Like, why doesn't I had a couple good friends, and that was it. I also think now it's so much more pervasive. So I say all that because I think that helped teach me my empathy. And what my parents had to go through, and like you hear the stories, like you get shielded from that when we were younger. But now your parents tell you the stories of what they were enduring in like the residency programs or at the hospitals and how patients didn't want them to touch them. It's like that was all it was happening. We were just shielded from it as kids because that was the way of life that they were brought up here. So I think that's where I learned my empathy, and I'm still constantly learning on how to be better as we all try to navigate this space of equity versus equality. It's a piece that I think society itself still has to continue to understand. It's like just general access. Like when you hear stories, patients like, yeah, when my hands are up here. Like if I ever get pulled over, my hands are here, and it's like I never had to worry about that, because I never thought of it. But that is scary, and you hear stories like that, and you're like, wow, okay.
So let me ask you this: your mom and dad grew up in India.
Yep.
So India, I know a bunch of people from India, having worked in the IT space. So many of the folks that I interacted with for almost 13 years came over from, India, the Middle East. They had all sorts of technical skills and all that. And I made some great friends. But I know in India, there's the caste system. I was actually just talking to a friend the other day. We were over at Topgolf, right down the street. And he's here, and his parents and his whole family's still over in India. And I asked him, I said, "What's the game plan? Are they coming here? Are you staying here?" He said, "I'll probably stay for another 10 years, and then I'm going back." And I said, "Oh, no kidding. So you're not here to stay?" He said, "No." He said, "Well, I'm excited to go back because," he said, "that's where everybody is, and they're not coming." And then he started telling me about what he's going back to. And he lives basically in a palace, and they've got butlers and maids and gardeners and very, very wealthy. So that caste system, I think, what were your parents' observations of maybe within the Indian community that existed? and then they come here and it exists in a different way. You follow what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We never really talked about that. So, we very much understand the caste system, and I would say I'm in the caste similar to probably your friend.
yeah,
We had all of that stuff whenever we went to visit family in India, all of it.
yeah,
But surprisingly, everyone in my family, on my dad's side, they all moved here to the U.S. and they've stayed here, found, made lives for themselves. And, that huge house that we used to visit, they still own. I think maybe they share it with another family now, like they left in-laws on the other side once moved, using it now. So I don't really know how our caste system worked here because again, I think we live this modest life, or I'd like to think so. Um, and the Indian community here that we connected with either were all the similar castes. I think people when they came over congregated to those with similar interests or similar upbringings because my parents came from the state of Gujarat, and what I remember from growing up is like we hung out with all the Gujaratis.
yeah,
Like that was the big group, and that's what I think is how we navigated all of this. Is
yeah,
they leaned on each other and had their close friends of the similar caste and no, from the same villages that they grew up in or the same neighborhoods. So they had this connection, even if they were like 5 years apart. Like, oh yeah, I knew that. I knew. We used to hang out there. Oh, I know your cousin so and so, and that was the immediate link.
yeah.
Yeah.
And given my color and I probably haven't experienced anything close to what you've experienced. The one time I clearly felt like not only the minority, but I don't know if I'm safe, was during 9/11. My wife and I were in Kenya and we were on our honeymoon when it happened. And all my friends have heard me tell this story a million times, but we were we were there for another couple of weeks. So when that all happened, we weren't coming home. And other than a couple of Americans, we didn't look like anybody else there. And there were people from all over the world, Middle East, India, all over Africa, Europe. But we stood out, like glaringly stood out.
Of course, yeah.
And we still had to go to different, we had to complete the honeymoon. We had to go from this location to that location. Every 4 days we'd go somewhere new. We would have to get on a little plane and a little airport. And I just remember wondering, are we in trouble? Are we targets? There's no hiding my skin color.
Yeah.
There's no hiding what anybody else's opinion might be of me. I don't know what they think. And I just remember just wondering, are we going down right now just because of what we look like? And it was the first time I actually felt somewhat unsafe. But the crazy part about it was I couldn't get over the kindness of people. Like people were actually kind and accepting. And I remember a guy sitting behind me on a plane. It was 2 days after 9/11. We got on a plane with, I don't know, maybe 20 seats on it. And the guy that sat behind me had a long beard and a turban. And I didn't know that a turban was a Sikh and Sikhs are peaceful. I don't know anything. And all I'm thinking is, oh my God. Because I was so ignorant. I was ignorant. I don't know. And this guy could not have been nicer, more conversational, more understanding. And I just go back to the whole concept of ignorance. And so like you wonder, as a child, when you look back on what you might have experienced and then what might have been coming back at you, or that poor black kid who moved out of the neighborhood, how much of it just comes from a place of, I don't know you, you look different, you don't look familiar, therefore we're going to treat you this way. And we don't have to explore the entire thing, but at the end of the day, that's what you're seeing every single day when you see that you work within a community where healthcare and these basic offerings that are available to us in the suburbs are the exception, where you are, and you can't access it in the same way. The people don't have the same ability to tap into it like we do. So it's got to be maddening. I mean, having experienced what you did as a kid, and then you see it firsthand all these years later, there's something still very broken about the way we live here. And then maybe you could comment on what it's like to go out on an ambulance and to see some of the stuff you've seen, and then how does that impact your ability to make decisions in your existing role? And I don't know, I'm all over the place with these questions, but I'm just like everything seems to tie together to me. Am I off base here, or?
I mean, I feel like it ties together. And let's make no mistake, whatever I experienced as a kid is nothing compared to what others experience day in and day out. At least, and never mind just in Dorchester, just any other person, black person or right now. It's just it's different. One, because I have to go back to it. My parents, they were educated. They had that access in India, so therefore they had that access here, even with their speed bumps in the road. And they may have been looked over in opportunities based on their race and ethnicity, but they still navigated it to a level of success that so many people here don't get access to. And I think that's part of the frustration. So I think one of the biggest pieces that's frustrating is when we have our patients come in and you just hear their stories, and many people are quick to say, well, they are in control of their destiny. They're not really, because they have been handcuffed with restrictions. There was redlining for, it's a very real thing that was around here. And that, like, when you learn about that and you understand that, you say, how could you have that kind of perseverance for generational, just getting up every single day and knowing that you are 2/3 of a human being in so many people's eyes, or 1/3 of a human being in so many people's eyes. It's just, I don't know how to process that. And so that's where my empathy comes in, saying, when someone is yelling at us for having a bad day, how much of that was our fault? Mm-hmm. Right. And that's the piece where we, as people who may have been more privileged, have to take a step back and say, wait, listen, yeah, my initial instinct is to yell back at this person. But in reality is, wait a second, the systemic issues that they have endured from them, their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, who was not allowed to make a decision for themselves. They were a person's property. Like just to go, like that's how many generations you go back. That's it. Like your great-grandparents were a slave. That is, if we just take a moment and think about that in our daily life, like your great-grand, like, how do you process? How do you even process that and not have a chip on your shoulder, right? And many people have moved on and been very successful. So I say all that because it's tying into how I process what I saw in the ambulance. And I work for a private ambulance company. I did get some 911 work when I was out in Metro West, or when I was stationed in downtown Boston. But a lot of it was taking people from private contract, like nursing homes or discharges from hospitals, to point A to point B. Right. But that being said, I've seen a lot of stuff from just the basic motor vehicle accidents to transporting Section 12 patients, and that's someone who's been on a psych order, who is committed to this, to the state, who's been committed, and transferring them, all walks of life. From the people out of Newton, I've transported who was on a Section 12 to a hospital because they were having a mental health breakdown. And this is 20 years ago, right? This is not what we're seeing today. Today is just exacerbated with limited providers, services, or in limited access. But back then, would go and take them to the hospital. Someone else's problem. From back then, they had state hospitals where there were a lot of young adults with mental health issues again, or some sort of deformity, and they had anger issues. I had someone with an impaled spoon in their eye.
Hmm.
So you kind of think about all those types of situations, and I just try to remind myself how blessed and lucky we are as a family with all the privileges we get and access we have that we don't need. Like I hate to come short of telling my wife yesterday that our kids are bougie and neither one of us are. So how did that happen? Where did we go wrong? But to teach them that all walks of life should be respected in a same way that, I mean, it's that basic fundamental, right? Everyone should be treated the way they want to be treated, and you kind of go about your day like that. And that's kind of where I try to remind myself day in and day from the most frustrating and restrictive areas where, health centers are almost, in my opinion, down there as well. Like we are the last stop. People see health centers as, well, maybe not anymore because COVID, I think, changed the appearance of what health centers are. But we don't serve poor people. We serve the communities that we are based in.
Hmm.
And that's, so I remind myself of that, and I use all of my experiences to help guide us with empathy and just trying to surround myself with strong individuals who may have lived experiences from their upbringings to help share that and lead this organization with that type of thought process.
How does somebody help Uphams or the community with an effective approach? By that I mean, I think it would be easy for somebody, to ride in on their white horse to save the day, and it could occur patronizing, like almost like tone deaf help. It's like the family in town that always donates the most money, and they sit in the first row in church, and they're always recognized. There's something very patronizing about their good deeds, and everyone around them's like, there they go again, and so I would think, there are obvious challenges and complex challenges in the community, poor or not. The bottom line is they exist. And how do you, one, I guess, help and support what is without coming across as ignorant or detached or patronizing? And then on the second side of that, it's how do you help anybody that wants to contribute to Uphams as an employee or as a partner or whatever? How do you teach somebody the patience and the empathy and the understanding that this is not easy? Like you're gonna go, you might actually be verbally assaulted. Your help might not be wanted, and still have the patience and resilience to hang in there, to serve the community, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, that last one's a big one because it is hard work. And so I meet with new hires every 2 weeks, and I tell them that I said this is some of the hardest work that you will ever. And I'll get to the patronizing piece after, because I think for recruitment purposes, you have to understand that yes, it's a paycheck, but it's more than that. If you're coming into this space, it takes a really hardened individual, dedicated individual to work in community nonprofit health space.
Yeah.
Now more than ever, you have to be willing to put up with everything you just mentioned, from someone swearing at you, yelling at you, really frustrated. We don't walk in their shoes. We don't know the experiences. Even if you grew up as their neighbor, you still don't necessarily know everything that person is going through in that moment. And to give them some empathy and space, apologizing is easy. Saying sorry, I'm sorry you're going through this. I'm just trying to help. So teaching that is hard, because when someone's in your face yelling at you and is cursing at you and is, hopefully not threatening you, but up until that line, you don't know. You don't know who that person is.
Right.
And it's hard. So we try to get these courses. Everything costs money, right? So I say all that because I think it takes a special individual to work in community health. The work is hard, frustrating, challenging. You may not always have your resources that you need. But at the end of the day, if you take that step back and see that impact you made, that is one of the most rewarding feelings ever. It is just knowing that you made a small impact in improving someone's quality of life, even by treating them with kindness when you answered the phone, even connecting them to get some food somewhere else, giving them a gift card from the company, helping navigate a complex healthcare world, speaking to them in their own tongue. These are all things that help us set ourselves apart from other healthcare providers. Other community health centers do very similar work, but everyone's uniquely different because we're based on our community. Our community right now is predominantly Cape Verdean and Hispanic. We have some Black people as well and some white people as well. But that's who we serve. And if you look at the global scale, Cape Verdeans aren't even categorized based on how the feds record them. They're recorded as Black patients, and they're really not. I mean, they should be categorized as Cape Verde because it's a different dialect, Portuguese Creole. I say all that because we just have to, it's hard work. And if you're able to navigate and know that you made an impact in someone's life, it's one of the most rewarding feelings. Now, for the patronizing piece, cash is cash, and someone wanting to donate to an organization either with time, with computers or IT infrastructure, we have never dedicated, we're working on it, but we have historically not been able to dedicate to our infrastructure as much as we would because we put that first into the patients, whatever we need to patient access, and then our staff. Like I said earlier today, probably 80% of our, and I don't remember the numbers, but most of our expenses is our salary line. It's about 50% now that I think about it. That's huge. And everything else is med supplies, and whatever's left over goes to equipment. And if equipment fails, we have to turn over this stuff, technology. In 6 months, that thing is obsolete. So how long can we stretch it?
Right.
We have vans that transport elderly people. These streets of Boston, the potholes, they beat the suspensions up pretty good, and the transmissions. And how do you go green at the same time? I'd love to get solar panels to help give back, either as free power to some community members in need, or just to help be a better social partner in how we take care of our environment. So at the end of the day, there's multiple ways people with great expertise can help out. Funding is drying up. It's harder and harder. Grants are getting more and more competitive, and we don't hire world-class grant writers. We may have one fall into our lap, but we have a grants position. We have someone who can write about it. So that's an opportunity. Some of these foundations that are offering up money, like we don't even know how to navigate those just because we never invested in developing. Other health centers are further along in that, but we at Uphams Community Care have never really invested, at least in my time here, in really creating like a development arm.
Okay. If somebody wanted to help you or talk to you about any of what you discussed with me, who should they contact? You, somebody else in the company, or is it different for depending on what they want?
I think they start with me. I'd love to talk to anybody,
Okay.
and then we can navigate what their interests are into the right individual here.
Okay. And would you recommend a LinkedIn connection or an email? Like how would you want somebody?
If you're making the connection, Dave, text, email is great. I think we had some tech issues on the email side, but anyway, if someone wants to give in some shape or fashion to us, any path, the path of least resistance.
Okay. All right. If I'm doing it, If I'm doing it, I'll text you. Just give everybody the proper spelling of your name on LinkedIn. Jagdeeptrivedi.
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay, okay. What else didn't we cover, Jay? Anything that because I put together a general framework for the conversation, and obviously I didn't stick to it because I end up feeding off of what you're saying. But is there
Sure.
anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to comment on before we wrap up?
I think knowing more about health centers is is just eye-opening to anyone. So I would suggest people watching a video from the Mass League of Community Health Centers. If you go to their webpage, you can understand the upstart of community health centers and why they really came about much better than how I was able to articulate it. I would also say, you know, we are a nonprofit. We had almost a 5% deficit last year. That was almost $3.5 million. We're about $60 million. We have 500 employees.
Hmm.
And because of that, we really worked hard not to reduce workforce, but we froze merit increases, we froze retirement contributions, things that people look at and things that people look as a recruitment tool. So we're working hard to fix our finances so far this year are looking stable. I say that only because one, I'm a transparent individual for better or for worse, and two, it's to understand that healthcare itself is in crisis, and these for profits. Everyone who opens a paper knows about the Steward crisis. There's Carney Hospital in our backyard here. If they shut down, those people are coming here. If someone takes over that hospital, the fear is that they're going to take our employees to help stabilize their organization. So you see the stewards. If you look up how many pharmacies closed within a 5-mile radius of Uphams Corner, you'll be shocked in the past 2 years. And what we did was, because of that, we converted our closed pharmacy, which was only able to serve our patients due to regulation. We opened it up to the community. We went full retail, so you can get your scripts filled here. Because, to your point, and we did that before we knew about the pharmacy deserts that are forming. So that was a bit proactive versus reactive. Oftentimes we are reactive, and that's something we are trying to change. But you have to have the bandwidth to be able to change. We are very operationally focused on how do we meet the needs today versus how can we continue to work to improve the quality of what we're providing tomorrow.
Right. I think no matter what you offer as a business, not profit or nonprofit, when it comes to serving other people, you're at the mercy of what their lives are like. I wonder how much of our challenges come down to the integrity of what should be a family, and how much we can do to help families get up on their feet. Because if we don't figure that out inside and outside the city, it everywhere, like the integrity of what a family ought to be is in question right now. And our public resources, or even our nonprofit resources, like you guys, you have no choice but to react to it. You know what I mean? And I don't know what the answer is, but something's got to give, where every single individual and every single family has to, at some level, get to a point. I don't know if it's today or 10 years from now, where they take a proactive approach to their lives. And it's going to take support from the community to help get them there. But it's not a one side or the other side. It's both sides have to come together.
They absolutely do.
Thank you for taking the time. This was really educational for me. There's a lot I didn't know here. I'll make sure I post this up, and any links that you want attached, please send to me. But I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate it. I hope I didn't ramble too much, and if we need to redo it, let me know.
No, you didn't ramble. I'm the rambler. You're not the rambler. It was great. I appreciate it. And I'll end up talking to you soon, but hang on for a second. All right, Jay, thanks.